exactly on Johnson's policies domestically, which was a massive undertaking, and it's one of those things where I really have to be quite selective about the specific programs and laws that were passed, because there's tons of them. So we're going to hit some high points here, but just keep in mind that there are just an avalanche of new laws and legislation to tackle a number of problems, some effective, some not, some that are still in place, many that are not. But you will see some things today that I think you will recognize, because we're going to see some programs and things established during the Johnson administration that do hold true to this day. Now, Johnson, of course, has some pretty big shoes to fill. Obviously, as we just saw, he becomes president. He was Kennedy's vice president. He becomes president immediately, of course, upon Kennedy's death. Johnson, just a tiny bit about him and his background and some of the values that he thought were important, some of his overall goals and sort of what shaped him. Johnson was a big contrast to Kennedy. You know, he was really nothing like Kennedy in several ways. Johnson, for one thing, is a Texan. He's a Southerner. In fact, Kennedy specifically chose Johnson as his running mate in 1960 to try to appeal to Southerners. Kennedy was a New Englander and wealthy and, you know, from a political family, and Johnson has much more humble roots. A Texan, he was born poor, he had been a teacher, he had taught in rural areas, and he was a very experienced politician, more probably than Kennedy had in Congress and so forth at that time. And he was a truly very gifted congressman. He's one of those people, you know, kind of like, you know, Henry Clay and some of the folks that came before him that were just gifted negotiators, good at making compromises, good at wheeling and dealing, you know, all that stuff. And he's just a lot of things rolled into one. Johnson's personality is he's just a little bit of everything. And anybody that worked for him and anybody that knew him would tell you that he could go from being the kindest, most gentle, most compassionate, wonderful person you met to being a total jerk in about 30 seconds. You know, he's just kind of an all-around mix of a lot of different things. But he was also very heavily influenced by Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. He is of that generation. And he very much was influenced by that ideology and that whole concept that Roosevelt believed in. Johnson also believes in this idea that government should help people, that government had a responsibility to look out for people, to provide for people's health and people's well-being, and to ensure, you know, a certain standard of living for people, to provide kind of a safety net for those kind of people. So his first priority was domestic policy. And we're going to see later as we move along that for Johnson, unfortunately for him, most of his administration and all the stuff we're going to talk about today will get overshadowed and really be dominated mostly by foreign stuff, particularly Vietnam, of course. And that becomes really probably more part of Johnson's legacy than his domestic programs for us. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So overall, all of Johnson's domestic agenda, all of these programs we're about to talk about, all these attempts, all these laws, it all gets grouped into an overall program that gets called the Great Society. So just like Roosevelt's gets called the New Deal, Johnson's is called the Great Society. It's not like he ever wrote down a piece of paper, hey, here's my plan for the Great Society. He uses that phrase in some speeches, and then the thing just kind of sticks, you know. And then all different things that he does, even stuff that was enacted prior to him starting to use that phrase, gets grouped in and called the Great Society. And there were multiple goals of the Great Society. Obviously, if it's called the Great Society, what's kind of the overall idea? Improve the country, make it better. There are so many things involved in this. It was about, you know, giving people a fair shot. It was about making sure that all people had the opportunities to make a good living, to have a good life, whether that meant having a good job, getting an education, having a decent home and decent living, being able to provide for your family. It was about tackling all kinds of injustices, poverty, just overall making a better world, a better society for everybody. And again, Great Society programs just go into so many different places. It's not just about helping poor people. That's a lot of it. But it's about improving daily life for everyone. And there's a lot about injustice and racism and things like that that the Great Society is going to promise. It's about health care. It is about welfare. It is about overall well-being. It's about economic development. There's just all sorts of things. And you can already see here how critics would say this is just so broad and so there's just too much going on here and getting into things that some might argue the government ought not to be getting into. Now, a big component of the Great Society, a big part of the Great Society, was what Johnson called a war on poverty. And he actually says that we're declaring a war on poverty. Now, what's poverty? Yeah, people that are poor, that do not have adequate income, that may not have adequate housing, all those kind of things. There had been a study, there was a book that was published not too long before this that Johnson was heavily influenced by a lot of Americans' work, called The Other America, that exposed a lot of the detestable poverty in parts of the United States, particularly in rural areas of the United States. Where here, and we talked about the United States being so affluent and economic expansion and everybody, homes for everyone, cars for everybody, all that kind of stuff. The Other America exposed that wasn't true for all people, that there was still terrible poverty in some parts of the world where some children didn't get enough to eat, where some children and some people didn't have running water in their houses, didn't have electricity, all of this. And Johnson said, that's crazy. We're the wealthiest country on earth. There's no reason why people ought to be living in poverty like that. So we're going to combat poverty by not giving handouts. This is different from the New Deal in that it's not about we're going to give benefits so much or give people money, but try to attack some of the causes of poverty itself, kind of give people opportunities, and this is kind of a common theme just in the Great Society as a whole, was provide resources and tools so that people can get out of poverty, so that people can make their life better, improve their own situation. Because part of what that Other America information and what Johnson believed in, was that poverty was a cycle. It was systemic. It was not just, oh, I don't have a job, but other things happened because of that. When people were poor, that meant they didn't have proper nutrition and they were unhealthy. And if they weren't healthy, then children would be missing school or people would be missing work. And then they're going to not be able to get as good of a job or not be able to keep one. And it just becomes a vicious cycle. And so Johnson wanted not to give, he called it not handout, but a hand up, try to give people a way to help themselves. So a big part, there's lots of things that are a part of the war on poverty, lots of laws that are passed and programs that are created that are about or part of the war on poverty. But probably one of the biggest landmark pieces of this or backbones of the war on poverty was something called the Economic Opportunities Act, which created lots of laws and programs to try to combat poverty. So this is where it can get complicated. It's like a vast network. This law creates all these things and so forth and so on. But the Economic Opportunity Act did create a lot of programs to try to, combat that systematic poverty, to try to improve or to, give people the resources to better themselves, like job skills, for example. You ever heard of Job Corps before? No? Upward Bound? No, not right there. Head Start? Sounds familiar? Okay. So these are all programs, those are all related to education in some way. Head Start is preschool for low-income families. There's not pretty Head Starts around here. We're in a pretty rural area. But particularly in a lot of cities and stuff, where people might be too poor to afford preschool. And the idea being by the time they get to elementary school, they're already behind, and they're going to continue to be behind, and then they won't go to college, and they won't be able to get good jobs. So those kind of programs like Head Start preschool funding. It created Job Corps as a job skills program for people, particularly in rural areas, to give for high school students or young adults to teach them job training skills so that they can be more productive workers, have some kind of education. It creates work-study programs. There's grants, there are loans, different things to try to give people the ability to better educate themselves, better improve their skills, so that more people could be more employable or have the chance for college or scholarship stuff. Upward Bound is a program for first-generation college students. They're oftentimes going to come from impoverished families to encourage and give them resources to be able to go to college. So just tons of stuff to help the poor help themselves, help them kind of get out of that cycle of poverty. It also includes not just rural poverty or attempts to help with rural poverty, but also urban poverty as well. So the Great Society, again, was really trying to reach a lot of different things. It is a very, very vast program. It includes things like the Housing and Urban Development Act. This had to do with urban poor, the urban poor, and urban renewal, people in urban areas that lived in substandard housing, stuff like that. The Housing and Urban Development Act, among other things, has provided money for proper housing. Is where you get like federal housing projects to provide proper housing for people in the cities, as well as just housing itself. You have, just money for loans or subsidies to help people keep their home or buy a home, to prevent people from, being evicted, stuff like that. So not just providing housing to low-income people, but resources, again, to try to help people procure other kinds of housing, those kind of things. There's also money for, this is where, there's a cabinet office today, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, that's created out of this to oversee all of that and to administrate your federal housing projects and all this money and these grants and all this stuff that's wrapped up into this to try to, spruce up urban areas, particularly those that were very poverty stricken. As people are moving to the suburbs, that meant folks and money was leaving the cities, leaving those places pretty blighted and desolate and not kind of run down. So the Housing and Urban Development Act was meant, among other things, to try to fix some of that. There are, again, more war on poverty programs that we can really count. And you'll also notice as we go through some of these other ones that they kind of overlap. There's other programs that may not, don't always get associated with the war on poverty, but they're related. There's all this kind of overlapping relationship between other things. Now, for a moment, let's take a look away from the Great Society programs, and because we really see more of those Great Society programs coming in after Johnson is elected in '64. He's finishing out Kennedy's term there at the beginning, and I'm not going necessarily in chronological order here, but election of 1964 was kind of a pivotal moment for Johnson. It's the first time he's running in his own right, and he ran against in 1964. So Johnson's running as the Democrat. His opponent, the Republican, was Barry Goldwater. Now, Barry Goldwater emerges as a leader of the Republican Party, but he has a very different kind of message than what the Republican Party has really sort of had up until this point. Goldwater, he was very much opposed to any of Johnson's Great Society programs. He's opposed to some of those old New Deal programs. He wanted to get rid of things like Social Security. He wanted to get rid of things like income taxes, stuff that by this point had been pretty much accepted, even by Republicans, as stuff that was just part of it now. It was just the way things were now, and there really wasn't much you could do about it. He felt that the Republicans had fallen away from their conservative roots of opposing, government intervention in this, that, and the other, of, not supporting government having such a big role. So he wanted to get rid of all of those things and wanted to reduce the size of government and reduce the amount of money that was being spent by the government and reduce federal programs and reduce federal regulations, get rid of all that stuff. And some people very much liked that idea. He did gain some support with that idea. But he also wanted a harder or a more aggressive line in Vietnam. This is when the Vietnam War was beginning to escalate. And Goldwater wanted it escalated even more. He wanted like really harsh bombing of Vietnam. He wanted to go at it a lot harder. And so that kind of scared off some people that he was, or a lot of people, enough people for sure, that he was wanting a more aggressive tone in the Cold War and a more aggressive tone certainly in Vietnam. And Johnson kind of jumps on board with that, portraying him as sort of trigger happy, and that if we elect him, we're going to end up getting into conflicts that we don't need to be in and stuff that's going to get out of control. In fact, this ad that I'm about to show you, very famous ad that ran in the 1964 election. Let's take a look at it.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
These are the steps to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So what was that saying about voting for Goldwater?
This has been a presentation.
That will, end up in nuclear war. And it's very, rather even now, I think, quite a startling sort of a ad. So obviously in 1964, Johnson wins, and he actually wins in quite a landslide victory. There we go. Okay, so Johnson does win the election, obviously quite in a pretty, very, very strong victory, as well as Democrats are going to take control of both houses of Congress. But Goldwater's campaign does kind of signify some changes that were really already kind of taking place, and some of that there's kind of a political realignment that's beginning to happen, and it really had already been happening as early as Eisenhower. So even though Johnson wins, there's kind of a Republican resurgence kind of happening here, because Goldwater does do well in some particular areas, particularly in the South. He does quite well, and that is unusual, very unusual, because remember, think back to like the beginnings of the Republican Party. I mean, the 1850s. Did the South support Republicans? No. I remember 1860, they weren't even on the ballot. They called the South, Democrats referred to the South as the solid South. You could guarantee that Democrats would get the South. Republicans had no shot, but that was beginning to change. It really started to change with Eisenhower. Eisenhower got, kind of more Southern votes than had really been done by a Republican before, and Goldwater signifies even more of that shift of Southerners beginning to embrace Republican leadership a little bit more. And this whole, get rid of big government, dismantle the welfare state, dismantle Social Security, all this kind of stuff. We don't need any of that. That's not the government's place. That is an idea that younger conservatives are going to start latching onto, and that is a movement that is starting to grow. And then, as some of you already know, that will really culminate in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. That's where that really kind of began. So it's a big turning point in this conservative movement. This, I don't mean anti-government is like we don't like government, but the anti-government involvement in the economy, government programs, that whole thing is really starting to gain some steam. And Goldwater kind of inspires a lot of that in some younger conservatives. So it's going to eventually lead to sort of laying the groundwork for what's going to be a huge political shift. Certainly probably one of the biggest political shifts that we've seen in modern times. Okay, so let's get back to more of Johnson's Great Society. Again, a lot of these things you'll see how they're all kind of related. I kind of tried to divide these up into some general areas, and then we'll mention, some of the laws or programs that were implemented in some of these specific areas. And we see even more Great Society programs being enacted after his election in 64, because they had, he assumed that to be a mandate, and he did win in a landslide electoral victory. to continue with these programs. Also, as I said, Democrats won Congress, so they were able to pretty much get their agenda through without a whole lot of Republican opposition. So one area of the Great Society was to improve health and welfare of people. There's a number of things involved in that. In fact, some of the really landmark accomplishments of the Great Society can come into this category. Here's where you'll probably hear some programs or some terms that you've heard before. Medicare is created, the Medicare Act. Hear about Medicare a lot in the news, on TV. Have I heard of Medicare? Yes, okay. Medicare is health insurance for the elderly. Health insurance for the elderly. Health insurance for people over the age of 65. And everyone, when they turn 65, qualifies for Medicare. This is an idea, it was actually an old idea that came up as early as Truman. Truman wanted something like this, and it had never gotten through. Kennedy had kind of wanted this as part of that new frontier and didn't get it. But Johnson is able to make that happen. Of course, that becomes one of the, now still quite a controversial program, but one of the very heavily guarded by lots of people, very important to a lot of people, and also one of the most expensive. Also, Medicaid comes from that. Many of you are probably familiar or heard of Medicaid before. It's kind of similar-ish to Medicare in that it is healthcare. Medicaid, however, is health insurance for low-income families. So you can see how that's also kind of part of that war on poverty, to help people that were poor who otherwise wouldn't be able to get health insurance, to provide health care coverage for them. So Medicare, everybody who turns 65 gets that, but Medicaid, that's what you call an entitlement program. I mean, everybody of a certain age, or in this case, is entitled to it. Medicaid is what you call a means-tested program, because people of a certain income level can receive Medicaid. Okay, other examples of things that were meant to improve people's health and overall welfare. Here's one that benefits pretty much all of you in here, the Child Nutrition Program. What's provided by the Child Nutrition Program? Your school lunch and breakfast eventually. So this is where the funding for school lunches comes from, and the requirement that schools provide lunches to all students, and that many may receive that at no cost to them or at a reduced cost to them. So once again, you can see how that's not just about overall health for everyone, but you can see how it's also kind of related to the war on poverty as well. There are other kinds of, welfare programs. You get food stamps from all of this to help people low income. There are more unemployment benefits when people lose their jobs, or disability benefits when they're not able to work. You have other kinds of just, more grants and subsidies and, different things like that to improve people's overall way of life, whether they were poor or if they've fallen on hard times or whatever the case may be. There's also like consumer protection. We talked about consumer protection in the past. Well, there's new consumer protection laws that fall kind of under this category. Laws about food labeling, like where you get like your ingredient labels on your food and all that kind of stuff, so you can tell what's in it. This is when, the Surgeon General says cigarettes are bad for you, and they start having to put warning labels on tobacco products and things like that, as part of, ensuring people's overall health and well-being and that sort of thing. Education was a big component of the Great Society. Johnson himself had been a teacher in his early life before he got into politics. And he knew not only how important that was, but how unequal that was in so many cases. And how people in rural areas, people in poor areas, just didn't have the same access to education, or the same kinds of education that people in more affluent areas had. So the big landmark piece of legislation regarding education was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is still around, still in effect. We just call it by some different names. It's been added on to and changed and modified and stuff over the years. More recently, you might have heard of this as No Child Left Behind, but that's the more modern word for it, but it's basically the same law. Among other things, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provides money, federal money for education. Before this, the federal government did not involve itself in education, in public education in schools. That was all the states, and it is still mostly the states that do that, and mostly states that fund their own education. But there is some funding that comes from the federal government, particularly poorer schools, schools that have less, money coming in of their own are going to be able to get more federal grants. You may have heard of Title I programs before, or Title I schools. That's comes from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to try to help those particularly rural schools or poorer schools catch up and be able to offer the same kind of services, whether that's more books or better facilities or pay their teachers better or offer some of the same kind of programs to improve a lot of that. This is also where you'll eventually get a lot of the, and this is particularly true of the more modern additions to it, like No Child Left Behind. This is where you get all your standards. You can thank the later versions of this for all the standardized tests you have to take. That's why we have those. Sorry. I blame them, not me. To check up and see how schools are doing and making sure that they're teaching the things they're supposed to teach and using the money the way they want them to. Okay. I mentioned consumer protection already a little bit. There's also, in addition to that, environmental protection as part of the Great Society. Now, the last time we talked about environmental protection, we saw that, for the first time in the progressive era. And that was mostly about like conservation, preserving our natural resources, not allowing, untouched places to be developed, making sure we're not over, chopping down too many trees, that kind of things. And so here we see environmental protection laws, not just about conserving, but restoring, like kind of recognizing we have done damage to a lot of natural resources. And we need to make sure that we reverse that damage, that we are being good stewards of our environment, and we are making sure that we're, for lack of a better phrase, cleaning up after ourselves. So not just about setting land aside and saying we're not going to develop it or use it, but this is where we'll get things like laws or regulations about clean water and clean air, setting standards for purity levels in water, and tons of laws that come later about solid waste disposal, and regulations and restrictions on how pollutants that go into the atmosphere, and requiring companies to clean that stuff up and have water purification, all that kind of stuff that I'm sure you've sort of heard of. We're not mentioning any of those specific laws, but overall that's where that comes from. Eventually things like Endangered Species Act and to protect even animals and other wildlife. I mentioned the consumer protection as far as food labeling and that kind of stuff. There's also like highway safety measures that come from the Great Society, rules about road safety, road signs, car safety, all those kind of standards and laws and regulations about that stuff. A lot of it goes back to the Great Society. So again, it's pretty expansive. It's pretty exhausting as far as how much it actually does cover. Now, there are, of course, all kinds of debates about how successful the Great Society really was, and how much did it actually do some of the things that it was meant to do. But I think a lot of people would argue that in the area of discrimination, of equality, and equal treatment, that this is probably where the Great Society does make some of its most lasting achievements. And this also gets us into, we're going to start looking at civil rights tomorrow, so this is actually kind of jumping ahead a little bit and looking at some of these laws as part of the Great Society, but we mustn't forget that, these laws we're about to talk about were the result of activism and the result of protest and the result of a larger movement that we know have been growing for decades. So we'll see both of these two things we're about to talk about again tomorrow when we look at the civil rights movement. So today we're just going to look at what's in these laws and include those as part of the Great Society. So tomorrow we look at all these movements that led to this, but a huge landmark achievement is the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is the federal law to make racial segregation illegal. So racial segregation that we've seen in the South mostly since the days of Reconstruction. Separate schools, separate train cars, separate buses, separate everything is made illegal by federal law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It makes any sort of public discrimination based on race or ethnic group or gender illegal. So a massive and monumental accomplishment of the civil rights movement signed into law by President Johnson in 1964. Again, tomorrow we'll talk more about the background leading to this and the demonstrations and the movements leading to it. But a year later, that is followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, once the Civil Rights Movement, successfully got the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it shifts its focus to voting rights in particular. Now, this is where I get a little concerned because some of the stuff that, where this came from, the background to this, came from that part last year that, we really didn't, we were either online or whatever happened, as far as the ways that African Americans in the South were kept from voting. So what were some of the things that Southern states had done and were doing by this point to keep African Americans from voting? Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, yes, all those things. African Americans were pretty much completely disenfranchised in the South. The Voting Rights Act of 1865 got rid of literacy tests, no more literacy tests, and it pretty much just gives the federal government the ability to monitor elections in really the South, but anywhere where they have a history or there is suspicion of them not letting people vote or using unfair practices. It gives the federal government the ability to oversee those elections and to get involved in it. And if they're going to make any kind of changes or do anything differently, they're going to clear that with the federal government, all this kind of stuff. It puts them in control, and they could take over state elections if necessary. You eventually also see the poll taxes abolished by a constitutional amendment. So this eliminates those literacy tests, and again gives the federal government the ability to come in and conduct elections or supervise elections or prevent or stop any of those discriminatory practices. So those two things are, again, probably, they're certainly the landmark achievements of the civil rights movement. Some of the big accomplishments of the Great Society is that they, for everything it maybe wasn't able to do or was only able to do marginally well, so forth and so on, it was able to translate those goals of the civil rights movement into actual federal law that has a massive impact. So we'll see those happen again tomorrow. Also, the Immigration Act of 1965, we haven't talked about an Immigration Act in a while. The last ones, remember, set up those quotas and restrictions on people from different nationalities. The Immigration Act of 1965 got rid of all of that. So it abolished all those quotas. No more discrimination based on national origin. So that also has to do with equality and not discriminating against people. There are still restrictions. It doesn't mean that it's totally unrestricted, but it's just an overall kind of general numbers, not so many of these people and so many of those people and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So again, there are hundreds more programs and laws and grants and offices and all this stuff that we could talk about. But let's just take just a quick kind of overall look at the accomplishments and failures of the Great Society. The Great Society remains, still, people debate, like they debate anything about how successful it was. So we'll kind of look at both sides of things. Those that would say that it did some stuff well, but also some areas in where maybe it didn't quite do so much. Overall accomplishments of the Great Society. It does, poverty is reduced. It is reduced in the United States. Poverty rates do go down, but it certainly did not eliminate it. The true goal, a very quite idealistic one, was that it would eliminate poverty, and there would be no more poverty. Obviously, that does not happen, but it does eliminate it. Not eliminate, I just said that was wrong. It does lower it. The poverty rate does decrease, particularly in certain rural areas. Huge accomplishment we just mentioned is that guarantee of civil rights and voting rights. Those certainly should not be ignored as major accomplishments of the Great Society. You do get some what are quite appreciated and quite important to a lot of people programs like Medicare. That's one of those real tricky subjects for a lot of politicians because it is quite expensive, but you got to be real careful what you say about it because there's a lot of people that depend on that and that think it is very important. older people and older people vote. So, it's one of those things that's so entrenched now. I don't know how you could possibly get rid of it. But those are quite important to a lot of people. You do get a lot of, important safety measures, consumer protection laws, and things like that that arguably, have benefited a lot of people. A lot of programs to help health and education and all of that have helped a lot of people and that a lot of people do rely on. But there are also a lot of criticisms, of course, that will go along with that. So let's just take a second to talk about some of the things that it either couldn't do or, sort of side effects, of a lot of that stuff, concerns over it. Big concern, of course, is cost, expense. This is all very expensive. Medicare is, I believe, the biggest expense of the United States government. If you got to look at all the expenses, Medicare is number one. I think it's even surpassed military spending by this point. Is it? What is it?
29% U.S. federal.
Is that more than military?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
Like 4%.
It's the largest entitlement program, and that's something that's been really strained with those baby boomers all over 65 pretty much by now. That's a big concern, is that expense and how it gets paid for. And also the concern that is one of the things that may have caused healthcare costs to skyrocket over the past couple of decades, is that when hospitals didn't really have to worry so much about keeping costs down because Medicare is going to foot the bill, that costs have continued to go up, and that's just kind of exacerbated the whole problem, thus making Medicare and health insurance otherwise quite expensive. So big concerns about the expense and the size and how you keep on funding it, and is it sustainable to fund it and all that kind of stuff. And also just concerns about a lot of that money not getting to where it really needs to go. And this is concern over a lot of government programs that you create this bureaucracy. And that, is where a lot of the money ends up. That money that's meant to go to the poor, that half of it ends up paying the salary of this person and, making sure they got this office building and all of the infrastructure that has to be put in place to do a lot of those things. So overall, it is quite expensive. There are, of course, concerns about whether or not the federal government could or should, worry about health and welfare and all those kind of things. Concerns about welfare in general, and if that makes people dependent on it and not wanting to help themselves and all those sorts of things. And overall, for all the successes of the Great Society, like I mentioned a little bit ago, it's all eventually really overshadowed by Vietnam. And that was another thing that made this far more economically straining. Is that the United States is also involved down in the Vietnam conflict, which was, incredibly controversial, and the public opinion eventually becomes quite negative with that, and so that eventually kind of overshadows it and tarnishes Johnson's legacy. And instead of being remembered for a lot of these programs, instead remembered for some questionable decisions and, quite controversial decisions over the war in Vietnam. So there are still certainly a lot of Great Society programs around even now. A lot of those you probably were familiar with, but some of them will be gotten rid of over the next couple of decades, or mismanaged, underfunded, things like that. Okay. So any questions so far?